The spring of 1942 brought an unusual chill to the waters of the inland sea. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto sat in the dim light of his cabin aboard the battleship Yamato, the most formidable vessel ever constructed by human hands. Outside, the fleet lay at anchor near Hashirajima, a collection of steel and firepower that represented the pinnacle of Japanese naval might. Inside, the admiral held papers that filled him with a dread he could barely articulate. The document before him outlined Operation MI, the planned assault on Midway Atoll. On paper, the strategy was elegant, almost beautiful in its complexity. Multiple carrier groups, diversionary strikes, coordinated movements across thousands of miles of ocean. It was the kind of plan that revealed the mind of someone who understood naval warfare at its highest level. And yet, as Yamamoto read through each page, as he traced the movements of ships and the timing of strikes, he felt his stomach tighten with apprehension. 3 decades of naval service had given Yamamoto an instinct for operations. He could sense when a plan would work, when the pieces fit together properly. This instinct had served him well throughout his career, from his early days as a young officer through his rise to command of the combined fleet. But now, that same instinct was screaming at him that something was terribly wrong. The plan relied on too many assumptions. It required perfect timing across vast distances. It depended on the enemy behaving exactly as predicted. Most troubling of all, it was built on a foundation that Yamamoto knew to be completely false. The belief that America was weak, demoralized, and incapable of mounting an effective response. Unlike virtually every other senior officer in the Imperial Japanese Navy, Yamamoto had actually experienced America firsthand. He had not simply read reports or studied intelligence summaries. He had lived there. For 2 years, he had studied at Harvard University, immersing himself in American culture and education. Later, he had served as a naval attaché in Washington, walking the halls of power and observing how American government functioned. But more importantly, he had travelled. He had visited the steel mills of Pittsburgh, watched molten iron pour forth in quantities that staggered the imagination. He had toured the oil fields of Texas, endless derricks pumping black gold from the earth at a rate that made Japan's entire oil supply look pitiful by comparison. He had stood in automobile factories in Detroit, watching assembly lines produce cars with a speed and efficiency that seemed almost magical. He had seen the vast agricultural heartland, the endless wheat fields, the infrastructure of roads and railways that connected a continent. These experiences had given Yamamoto a perspective that none of his colleagues possessed. While they saw America through the lens of Japanese propaganda as a soft nation of materialistic weaklings, Yamamoto had seen the reality. America was a sleeping industrial colossus. Its production capacity was beyond anything Japan could match. Its resources were virtually unlimited. Its people, despite what Japanese propaganda claimed, were neither weak nor cowardly. And Yamamoto understood, with a clarity that kept him awake at night, that the attack on Pearl Harbor had awakened that giant. The sneak attack, hailed in Japan as a brilliant victory, had unified American public opinion in a way nothing else could have. It had transformed America's industrial capacity from peacetime production to wartime mobilization. And once that machinery was fully engaged, once those factories and shipyards and training facilities were operating at full capacity, Japan would face an avalanche of steel and fire that no amount of courage or fighting spirit could withstand. He had tried to warn them. Before Pearl Harbor, in the planning sessions where the war strategy was being developed, Yamamoto had spoken clearly about Japan's limitations. He had told them that Japan might run wild for 6 months, perhaps a year. But after that, when American production reached full speed, when the weight of their resources came to bear, Japan would be crushed. They had dismissed his warnings as excessive caution. Some had questioned his patriotism. Others had suggested his time in America had made him too sympathetic to the enemy. The victories that followed Pearl Harbor had seemed to vindicate the optimists. The rapid conquest of the Philippines, Malaya, Singapore, the Dutch East Indies. Japanese forces had swept across the Pacific and into Southeast Asia with stunning success. Each victory had reinforced the belief that Japanese fighting spirit was superior, that American forces were paper tigers, that the war could be won quickly and decisively. But Yamamoto knew better. These early victories were happening during his predicted window, the 6 months when Japan's advantage in trained forces and positioned assets gave them the initiative. But that window was closing, and this Midway operation, with all its complexity and its flawed assumptions, might be the catastrophic mistake that ended Japan's brief moment of advantage. The problem was that Yamamoto was trapped. The plan had not originated with him. It had been developed by the Naval General Staff and approved by Imperial General Headquarters. The Emperor himself had been briefed on the operation. To oppose it now, to stand up and declare that the plan was fundamentally flawed, would be to challenge the judgment of the entire command structure. In the culture of the Imperial Japanese Navy, such opposition was unthinkable. Loyalty meant following orders. Obedience meant not questioning one's superiors. To do otherwise was not merely career-ending, but potentially life-threatening. So Yamamoto did what countless competent officers have done throughout history when trapped in hierarchical systems that punish dissent. He swallowed his objections. He prepared his forces. He hoped desperately that his fears were unfounded. But deep in his heart, he knew they were not. The operational plan for Midway rested on a series of interconnected assumptions, each one seemingly reasonable in isolation, but collectively forming a structure as fragile as a house of cards. Yamamoto had examined each assumption carefully, and with each examination his concerns had grown. The first assumption was that Japanese naval codes remained secure. The planners assumed that even if Americans intercepted Japanese communications, they could not decrypt them quickly enough to matter. This assumption was based on assurances from Japanese cryptographers who insisted that the JN-25 code was essentially unbreakable. But Yamamoto had his doubts. He knew the Americans were not fools. They had skilled mathematicians and codebreakers. And more importantly, they had motivation. After Pearl Harbor, breaking Japanese codes would be a top priority. To assume the codes were secure seemed dangerously complacent. During one planning meeting, held in a conference room where sunlight streamed through windows overlooking the harbour, Yamamoto had raised this concern. The room had been filled with officers, maps spread across tables, models of ships arranged in formations. The air had been thick with cigarette smoke and confidence. "Admiral, what if the Americans have broken our codes?" Yamamoto had asked quietly. "What if they know we are coming to Midway? What if they are preparing a trap?" His chief of staff, Rear Admiral Matome Ugaki, had responded with barely concealed impatience. "The codes are unbreakable, Admiral. Our cryptographers have examined them thoroughly. The mathematical complexity alone makes decryption virtually impossible. And even if the Americans intercept some messages, they cannot possibly decrypt them in time to affect operations." Yamamoto had persisted, choosing his words carefully. "The Americans are intelligent and resourceful. They understand the importance of communications intelligence. We should not underestimate their capabilities. I believe we should assume our communications are compromised and plan accordingly." Ugaki had grown more irritated. "With respect, Admiral, you are being excessively cautious. We have achieved complete surprise in every operation since Pearl Harbor. At Pearl Harbor itself, in the Philippines, at Singapore. In every case, the enemy was caught unprepared. There is no reason to believe Midway will be different. But Yamamoto knew there was a very good reason. The previous month, American bombers had struck Tokyo itself. The Doolittle raid, as it would come to be known, had been a psychological shock to Japan. The idea that American aircraft could reach the homeland had shaken the assumption of invulnerability, but more significantly to Yamamoto, the raid demonstrated something about American intelligence and operational capability that his colleagues seemed to have missed. Those bombers had been launched from carriers that had approached Japan undetected, struck, and then escaped. That suggested American intelligence about Japanese naval dispositions was far better than assumed. It suggested American carriers were being handled aggressively and skillfully, and it suggested that American commanders were willing to take calculated risks, exactly the kind of aggressiveness that could turn the tables at Midway. The second major assumption in the Midway plan concerned American carrier locations. The plan presumed that American carriers were in Pearl Harbor or nearby waters, that they would need several days to reach Midway after the attack began. This assumption was critical because it meant Japanese forces could attack Midway, lure out American ships, and destroy them piecemeal as they arrived. But what if the carriers were not in Pearl Harbor? What if American intelligence had warned them? What if they were already at sea, positioning themselves for an ambush? Yamamoto had pressed this point as well. "We need better reconnaissance," he had insisted in another meeting. "We need to know exactly where the American carriers are before we commit to the attack. We cannot assume they will be where we want them to be." But the reconnaissance plan itself was flawed. There had been a proposal for a long-range seaplane flight over Pearl Harbor to verify carrier locations before the operation began. But that plan had been cancelled due to concerns that the reconnaissance flight itself might alert the Americans that something was being planned. It was a catch-22 situation. They needed intelligence, but feared that gathering it would compromise the operation. Similarly, the plan called for a submarine picket line to be established between Hawaii and Midway to spot American ships leaving Pearl Harbor. But the timing of this picket line was fatally delayed. The submarines would not be in position until after American carriers might already have sailed. It was a gap in the plan that worried Yamamoto deeply, but once again his concerns were waved away as excessive caution. The third assumption was that a diversionary attack on the Aleutian Islands would draw American forces northward, away from Midway. This seemed logical on the surface. Attack one location and the enemy will send forces to defend it, leaving another location vulnerable. But Yamamoto questioned whether the Americans would actually fall for such a transparent ruse. If their intelligence was good, if they knew Midway was the real target, they would not be diverted. The Aleutians' attack would accomplish nothing except to split Japanese forces across an even wider area. The fourth assumption was that Midway's defences could be quickly neutralised by the initial carrier strike. The plan called for the carriers to launch an attack on Midway, destroy its air defences and prepare the way for an invasion force. But what if the initial strike was not sufficient? What if Midway's defences were stronger than expected? The plan provided for a second wave if needed, but launching that second wave would take time during which the carriers would be vulnerable. The fifth assumption, and perhaps the most dangerous, was that when American ships did respond, they would arrive piecemeal and could be destroyed individually. The entire plan was based on the idea of defeating American forces in detail, catching them as they arrived and destroying them before they could concentrate. But this assumption only held true if everything else went according to plan. If the Americans were already there, if they were coordinated, if they struck together, the situation would be completely different. What troubled Yamamoto most was not any single assumption, but the fact that the entire plan required all of them to be correct simultaneously. It was a chain of assumptions, and like any chain, it was only as strong as its weakest link. If even one assumption proved false, the entire operation could unravel. But perhaps the most troubling aspect of the planning process was what happened during the Wargames. In May of 1942, a few weeks before the operation was to launch, the Naval General Staff conducted elaborate wargames to test the plan. These exercises used a large table covered with a map of the Pacific, with models representing ships and aircraft. Officers moved the pieces according to strict rules meant to simulate combat realistically. Yamamoto had participated in these games with great interest. He wanted to see how the plan would hold up under scrutiny, wanted to see if the potential problems he had identified would emerge during the simulation. And they did. In one crucial scenario, the umpires ruled that American carrier aircraft had found the Japanese carriers during a vulnerable moment when their decks were crowded with aircraft being refueled and rearmed. In the game, the American strike was devastating. Multiple Japanese carriers were ruled to have been hit and severely damaged. It was exactly the scenario Yamamoto had feared. A moment of vulnerability exploited by an aggressive enemy. The Wargame had revealed the weakness in the plan. For a brief moment, Yamamoto had hoped this would lead to meaningful changes in the operational scheme. But then something extraordinary happened. One of the senior officers overseeing the war games, a man who had been instrumental in developing the Midway plan, intervened. He declared that the scenario was unrealistic. American carriers, he stated, would not be in a position to launch such an attack. American morale was too low, their commanders too cautious. The ruling was overturned. The hits on the Japanese carriers were erased. The game continued as if the problem had never occurred. Yamamoto had watched this happen with a mixture of anger and despair. The war game had shown them exactly what could go wrong. It had revealed the plan's critical vulnerability. And rather than address the problem, rather than adjust the plan to account for this weakness, they had simply erased it. They had changed the rules of the game to ensure the outcome they wanted. He had spoken up, carefully but firmly. Perhaps we should consider what would happen if American carriers do attack during our most vulnerable moment, when our flight decks are crowded with aircraft. How would we respond? Do we have procedures in place? Ugaki had been dismissive. Admiral Yamamoto, the scenario is simply too unlikely to merit serious consideration. We are planning for realistic contingencies, not worst-case fantasies. The American carriers will not be in position, and even if they were, their commanders lack the aggressiveness to exploit such an opportunity. But to Yamamoto, who had studied at American military institutions, who had observed American officers, who understood American military culture, it was not a fantasy at all. It was exactly what an aggressive, well-informed American commander would do. The kind of commander who would launch bombers against Tokyo from carriers in dangerous waters. The kind of commander who would see an opportunity and seize it without hesitation. The war games had provided the answer. They had shown the plan's fatal flaw, and the response had been to deny the problem existed. This, more than anything else, convinced Yamamoto that the operation was doomed. In a culture where uncomfortable truths were simply dismissed, where planning was based on wishful thinking rather than hard assessment, disaster was inevitable. As the departure date approached, Yamamoto found himself in an impossible position. He knew the plan was flawed. He knew the assumptions were questionable. He knew that if the Americans had broken the codes, if they were waiting at Midway, the operation would fail catastrophically. But he also knew that he could not stop it. The machinery of war had been set in motion. The Emperor had been briefed. The fleet was assembling. To oppose the operation now would be to commit professional suicide. And even if he were willing to sacrifice his career, even if he resigned in protest, someone else would simply take his place and carry out the operation anyway. So Yamamoto made his peace with the inevitable. He would execute the operation as ordered. He would hope that his fears were unfounded, that somehow the plan would work despite its flaws. And he would be ready to respond if things went wrong. But in his heart, he knew they would go wrong. The only question was how bad it would be. On the morning of May 27th, the main body of the combined fleet departed from Hashirajima. Yamamoto stood on the bridge of the Yamato, watching the massive vessel get underway. The ship was extraordinary, over 260 meters long, displacing more than 70,000 tons. Its main guns were the largest ever mounted on a warship, capable of hurling shells weighing more than a ton across distances of over 40 kilometers. It was the ultimate expression of battleship design, a floating fortress that seemed invincible. But Yamamoto knew that in the kind of battle they were sailing toward, the Yamato's massive guns would be useless. This was going to be a carrier battle, decided by aircraft launched from flight decks hundreds of kilometers away. The battleship, for all its awesome power, would be a spectator, and that was yet another flaw in the plan. The fleet's composition was optimized for a battleship engagement that would never happen, while the carriers that would actually fight the battle were dispersed and inadequately supported. The fleet that sailed from Japan was actually not one fleet, but several, spread across vast distances. The carrier striking force, the Kido Butai, would approach Midway from the northwest. The invasion force, with its transports and supporting ships, would come from the west. Yamamoto's main body, with the battleships, would follow far behind. And in the north, another force would attack the Aleutian Islands. All of these forces were operating under strict radio silence, unable to communicate except in the most limited ways. If something went wrong, if one element ran into trouble, the others would not be able to help. It was the kind of dispersed operation that only works if everything goes according to plan, if the enemy behaves as predicted, if there are no surprises. Yamamoto knew from experience that in war, nothing ever goes entirely according to plan. The enemy always does something unexpected. Surprises are the rule, not the exception. To base an entire operation on the assumption that everything would work perfectly was foolish. As the Yamato ploughed through the waters of the Pacific, heading toward what Yamamoto feared would be a disaster, he spent long hours alone in his cabin. He wrote letters, played shogi with members of his staff, and maintained an outward appearance of calm confidence. But inside, he was deeply troubled. He kept running through the scenarios in his mind, trying to think of ways to salvage the operation if things went wrong. But the more he thought about it, the more he realized how little control he would have. The carrier force was under the command of Admiral Chuichi Nagumo. Once the battle was joined, once the carriers were engaged, there would be nothing Yamamoto could do. He would be 300 miles away, too far to influence events. The first few days of the operation proceeded according to plan. The Aleutians' attack went forward as scheduled. The various elements of the fleet moved toward their objectives. Radio silence was maintained. Weather was reasonable. There were no apparent problems. But Yamamoto could not shake his sense of foreboding. Everything was going too smoothly. It felt like the calm before a storm. On the morning of June 4th, Yamamoto was on the bridge of the Yamato at dawn. The main body was still 300 miles behind the carrier force. At this distance, they could do nothing but wait for reports from Admiral Nagumo. The morning was clear, with good visibility. Ideal conditions for carrier operations, which meant ideal conditions for both sides. The first reports from Nagumo were positive. The strike against Midway had been launched successfully. Over 100 aircraft were heading toward the atoll. The initial elements were already engaging Midway's defences. Everything seemed to be proceeding as planned. Yamamoto felt a flicker of hope. Perhaps his fears had been unfounded. Perhaps the plan would work after all. But then came the message that shattered that hope. Enemy surface force of 10 ships sighted, bearing southeast, distance 240 nautical miles from Midway. Course north. Speed 20 knots. Yamamoto felt as if the deck had dropped away beneath his feet. American ships. Here. Now. They were not in Pearl Harbor. They were not days away. They were already in position. His worst fear had come true. The Americans had known. They had set a trap, and the Kido Butai had sailed directly into it. He forced himself to remain calm, to show no outward reaction. Around him on the bridge, other officers were discussing the report, trying to understand what it meant. Some suggested it might be a patrol force, a few cruisers and destroyers that had stumbled onto the operation by chance. But Yamamoto knew better. 10 ships, organized in a formation, heading north toward the carriers. This was not a random encounter. This was a coordinated response. Minutes later, another message arrived. Enemy force includes what appears to be a carrier. The bridge fell silent. A carrier. The Americans had positioned a carrier force at Midway. They had known where to be and when. The implications were staggering. It meant Japanese codes had been broken. It meant American intelligence knew the entire plan. It meant every assumption the operation was based on had been wrong. Yamamoto's staff erupted in shocked discussion. How was this possible? The intelligence had been clear. The carriers were supposed to be in Pearl Harbor. This could not be happening. But it was happening, and Admiral Nagumo, out there with the carrier force, was about to face the fight of his life against an enemy that had achieved complete tactical surprise. Yamamoto immediately ordered increased speed. If they could close the distance, if they could get the battleships within range, perhaps they could still influence the battle. But even as he gave the order, he knew it was futile. At maximum speed, the Yamato could perhaps make 27 knots. It would take the better part of a day to reach the battle area. Whatever happened out there, Nagumo would have to handle it alone. The next few hours were agonizing. Messages from the carrier force arrived sporadically. American aircraft from Midway were attacking. Torpedo bombers, outdated and slow, were being shot down in large numbers. None had scored hits. The Defensive Combat Air Patrol was working effectively. Nagumo was recovering his Midway strike aircraft and preparing to launch a counterattack against the American carrier that had been spotted. To the staff officers around Yamamoto, this sounded like the operation was still under control. The Americans were attacking but being repulsed. Japanese forces were adapting to the situation. But Yamamoto understood the operational timeline and realized what was happening. Nagumo's aircraft were landing back aboard the carriers. They needed to be refueled, rearmed. The carriers' flight decks would be crowded with aircraft, fuel lines, ordnance. It was exactly the vulnerable moment that had been revealed in the Wargames, the moment they had dismissed as unrealistic. At approximately 10:30 in the morning, a message came through that stopped every conversation on the Yamato's bridge. Akagi, Kaga and Soryu hit by enemy dive bombers. Fires out of control. Heavy damage. For several seconds, nobody moved. Nobody spoke. The words seemed impossible to process. 3 carriers, 3 fleet carriers. Hit simultaneously. It could not be real. But more details followed, each one worse than the last. Direct bomb hits on all 3 ships. Fires spreading rapidly. Secondary explosions from stored ordnance and aviation fuel. The ships were being torn apart from within. Yamamoto stood frozen, his face showing nothing but his mind racing. In the span of perhaps 5 minutes, the heart of the combined fleet's carrier force had been ripped out. The Kido Butai, which had struck Pearl Harbor, which had swept across the Pacific undefeated for 6 months, had been destroyed. The plan had collapsed exactly as he had feared it would. An aggressive American commander had found the vulnerable moment and exploited it perfectly. One of his staff officers, his voice shaking, asked the question everyone was thinking. "Admiral, what are your orders? Should we proceed with the invasion? Perhaps the battleships can provide gunfire support for the landing force?" Yamamoto looked at the man, seeing the desperate hope in his eyes, the unwillingness to accept what had happened. And he knew what had to be said, even though it would be one of the hardest things he had ever said. Without air cover, the invasion force would be slaughtered by American aircraft. The operation is cancelled. Order Admiral Nagumo to withdraw all remaining forces. All units are to retire westward immediately. The order went out. The great operation, planned for months, approved by the highest levels of command, was over. Not merely failed, but catastrophically defeated. And they were 300 miles away, powerless to do anything but watch as the disaster unfolded. Throughout the day, more reports trickled in, each one adding to the scale of the defeat. The Hiryu, the 4th carrier, had managed to launch a counterstrike that hit and damaged an American carrier. For a brief moment, there had been hope that at least one Japanese carrier might survive. But then American dive bombers found the Hiryu as well. More hits, more fires. By evening, all 4 carriers of the Kido Butai were burning wrecks, either sunk or sinking. The pilot losses were even more catastrophic than the ship losses. Over 3,000 men dead or missing, and among them, the most experienced and skilled naval aviators in Japan. Men who had trained for years, who had participated in every major operation since Pearl Harbor. These were not replacements that could be trained quickly. Each pilot represented years of investment in training and experience, and they were gone in a single day of battle. That night, alone in his cabin with the door secured, Yamamoto allowed himself to face the full reality of what had happened. The plan he had doubted, the operation he had questioned, had failed exactly as he had feared. And because he had lacked the courage or the power to oppose it more forcefully, because he had valued his position and followed orders, thousands of men were dead. And Japan's strategic position in the Pacific was crippled, perhaps fatally. He thought about his time in America, decades before, walking through those factories in Pittsburgh, watching the steel pour, standing in the shipyards, seeing how quickly ships could be built, touring the oil fields of Texas, understanding the vast energy resources America commanded. He had tried to tell his colleagues what it meant, tried to make them understand that Japan could not win a long war against such industrial might. They had dismissed him as too cautious, too impressed by American material advantages. But he had been right, and Midway had just proven it beyond any doubt. The Americans had lost one carrier, the Yorktown. It had been hit by the Hiryu strike and would eventually sink. But Yamamoto knew the Americans had more carriers coming, many more. The Essex-class construction program was already underway. Intelligence reports indicated that American shipyards were building fleet carriers at a rate that seemed almost impossible. Within a year, America would have more carriers than Japan had started the war with, and Japan had just lost 4 of its 6 fleet carriers in a single day. The mathematics were brutal and undeniable. America could replace losses. Japan could not. America's industrial capacity was so vast that even major defeats were merely temporary setbacks. Japan's resources were so limited that every loss was permanent. And the pilot training situation was even worse. American flight schools were graduating thousands of new aviators, each with hundreds of hours of training. Japan's pilot training program, already strained by the demands of the expanding war, could not possibly replace the experienced aviators lost at Midway. Yamamoto understood that June 4, 1942, might be remembered as the day Japan lost the war. Not because the war was over, battles would continue for 3 more years, but because the window of opportunity he had spoken of, the 6 months when Japan might have been able to achieve a favourable negotiated peace, had closed. From this point forward, every day would see America growing stronger while Japan grew weaker. The long war of attrition he had warned about, the war Japan could not win, had begun. In the days following the battle, Yamamoto faced yet another agonizing challenge. How to report the disaster to Imperial General Headquarters. The full truth would be devastating to national morale. It would validate every warning he had given that had been dismissed. It would prove that the Americans were not the weak, demoralized enemy that Japanese propaganda portrayed. And most dangerously, it would raise fundamental questions about the entire war strategy. His staff urged him to minimize the extent of the losses in the official report. "We can report 2 carriers lost instead of 4, one officer suggested. We can emphasize the damage we inflicted on the Yorktown. We can present it as a tactical setback rather than a strategic disaster. If we report 4 carriers lost, it will cause panic." Yamamoto wrestled with this decision for hours. As a professional military officer, he knew that accurate reporting was essential. Commanders needed to understand the true situation in order to make proper decisions. Hiding the extent of the defeat would prevent the Navy from learning the necessary lessons, from making the changes that might prevent future disasters. But he also understood the political reality. To fully reveal the scale of the defeat would create chaos in the high command. It might even threaten support for the entire war effort. In the end, Yamamoto compromised. The official report acknowledged the loss of all 4 carriers. That much could not be hidden. But it downplayed the loss of pilots and aircrew. It emphasized the hit on the Yorktown and suggested the Americans had suffered proportionate losses. It was the truth, but softened, an honest assessment wrapped in face-saving language that made the disaster seem less catastrophic than it actually was. Even this partial honesty was too much for some in the Imperial General Headquarters. There was pressure to suppress even more of the truth, to present Midway as some kind of victory. The surviving officers and sailors from the battle were quarantined upon their return to Japan. They were forbidden from discussing what had happened, even with their families. The official propaganda proclaimed Midway as a successful operation. The lost carriers were kept on the Navy's official roster for months, their status listed as ambiguous or under repair. This systematic denial meant that the Japanese Navy never fully came to terms with what had gone wrong at Midway. The flaws in the plan were not properly examined. The intelligence failure was not acknowledged. The cultural problems that had led to dismissing Yamamoto's concerns were not addressed. They were repeating the same pattern that had caused the defeat in the first place, ignoring uncomfortable realities, dismissing evidence that contradicted their worldview, prioritizing loyalty and face-saving over honest assessment. Yamamoto participated in this cover-up, and it haunted him. As a professional who valued truth and accurate evaluation, he understood that they were setting themselves up for more failures. But he also understood that he had no choice. To insist on full disclosure would accomplish nothing except to end his career and possibly worse. So he remained silent about his doubts, issued the sanitized reports, and watched as the Navy continued down the path toward defeat. In private conversations with trusted officers, men who had served with him for years and whose discretion he could rely upon, Yamamoto was more honest. We lost at Midway because we underestimated the Americans and overestimated ourselves. We assumed our codes were secure when they were not. We assumed the Americans were weak and demoralized when they were neither. We assumed we could fight the battle on our terms when we could not. Every single assumption was wrong. One young officer, a man who would later survive the war and write about these conversations, asked him directly, "Can we still win this war, Admiral?" Yamamoto had paused before answering, choosing his words carefully. Not as things currently stand. We won the war we were prepared to fight, the short war of the first 6 months. But that window is closed now. We are now fighting the long war I warned about, against an enemy with industrial capacity we cannot match. They will build 3 ships for everyone they lose. They will train 5 pilots for everyone we lose. The mathematics are against us. Then what should we do? The young officer had asked. We fight, we defend. We hope for a negotiated peace before we are completely overwhelmed. But hope is not a strategy. Without a fundamental change in the strategic situation, without something that forces America to the negotiating table, we will eventually be defeated. It is only a question of time. In the months after Midway, Yamamoto's predictions began to come true with terrible inevitability. The Americans launched their offensive at Guadalcanal in August of 1942. What followed was a grinding, brutal campaign that lasted 6 months. Japan committed everything available to hold the island. Troops, supplies, warships, and aircraft were poured into the battle. The Navy fought a series of night actions around Guadalcanal, some of which were Japanese victories. But each engagement depleted Japan's irreplaceable pool of experienced sailors and pilots. At the Battle of Santa Cruz in October, Japanese carrier aircraft managed to severely damage the Enterprise and sink the Hornet. On paper, it was a victory. The Americans had lost a fleet carrier, but Japan had lost 99 aircraft and their pilots in the battle. The Americans had lost 81, and while American losses would be made good within months, replaced by new carriers and fresh pilots from training schools, Japanese losses were permanent. Yamamoto called Santa Cruz a hollow victory. They were winning individual battles but losing the war. By early 1943, the pattern was undeniable. Japan had been forced entirely onto the defensive. The strategic initiative had passed permanently to the Americans, and American production was ramping up to levels that even Yamamoto, who thought he understood their capacity, found staggering. Intelligence reports spoke of Essex-class fleet carriers entering service at a rate of nearly one per month, light carriers being converted from cruiser hulls in less than 2 years, thousands of aircraft rolling off assembly lines. It was an industrial tsunami that Japan had no hope of matching. The production numbers made sobering reading. In 1942, the United States had produced over 47,000 military aircraft. Japan had produced fewer than 9,000. The ratio was getting worse, not better. By 1943, American production would exceed 85,000 aircraft, while Japanese production might reach 17,000 if they were lucky. Similar ratios applied to ships, to tanks, to every category of military equipment. America was outproducing Japan by factors of 5 to 1 or greater in nearly every category. The pilot training situation was equally dire. American flight schools were graduating thousands of new aviators every month, each with several hundred hours of training. Japanese training programs had been drastically shortened due to fuel shortages and the desperate need to rush replacements to the front lines. New pilots were arriving at frontline units with minimal preparation. Their life expectancy was measured in weeks. Meanwhile, the core of experienced Japanese naval aviators was being steadily whittled away in the grinding attrition of the Solomon Islands campaign. Yamamoto had warned about exactly this scenario: a long war of attrition against an industrial power with virtually unlimited resources. A war where every exchange favored the Americans because they could replace their losses and Japan could not. His warnings had been dismissed as defeatist, as showing insufficient confidence in Japanese fighting spirit. Now the reality was undeniable, but it was too late to change course. The war machine ground on, consuming resources and lives in battles that could not change the strategic outcome. On April 18, 1943, Admiral Yamamoto boarded a Mitsubishi G-4M bomber at Rabaul. He was flying to the Solomon Islands to inspect frontline forces and boost morale among the troops fighting there. It was a routine inspection tour, the kind of thing senior commanders did regularly. The visit had been carefully planned, with a detailed itinerary that specified exactly where Yamamoto would be at each moment of the day. What Yamamoto did not know was that American codebreakers, the same codebreakers who had decrypted Japanese messages before Midway, had intercepted and decrypted the flight plan. They knew exactly where he would be and when. A flight of P-38 Lightning fighters was dispatched to intercept him. They caught his plane exactly as scheduled, shot it down over the jungle, and killed the admiral along with everyone else aboard. Whether Yamamoto suspected the end was coming, whether he had any sense of the danger, is unknown. But there is a tragic irony in how he died, killed by the same intelligence failure he had warned about. The same American code-breaking capability that had doomed the Midway operation had now claimed his life. The codes he had questioned, the communications security he had worried about, had proven vulnerable just as he had feared. And that vulnerability had killed him. With Yamamoto's death, Japan lost its most capable naval strategist and the one senior officer who truly understood the war's strategic reality. His successors were either true believers in inevitable Japanese victory, men who genuinely thought fighting spirit could overcome material disadvantage, or political officers who understood the situation but were unwilling to speak uncomfortable truths. None of them had Yamamoto's combination of technical competence, strategic vision, and understanding of American capabilities. The war continued for more than 2 years after Yamamoto's death, but its outcome was never in doubt. American forces island-hopped across the Pacific, steadily approaching Japan itself. The Japanese Navy, already crippled at Midway, was ground down in a series of one-sided battles. At the Philippine Sea in June 1944, Japanese naval aviation was effectively destroyed in what American pilots called the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. At Leyte Gulf in October 1944, what remained of the combined fleet was shattered in the largest naval battle in history. By 1945, American bombers were systematically destroying Japanese cities. American submarines had strangled Japan's sea lanes, cutting off the oil and resources the nation needed to continue fighting. The industrial colossus Yamamoto had warned about had fully awakened, and it was crushing Japan exactly as he had predicted. After the war, when historians and military analysts examined the Battle of Midway, when they interviewed surviving Japanese officers and studied the operational plans, Yamamoto's fears and warnings were completely vindicated. Every concern he had raised had been legitimate. Every assumption he had questioned had been wrong. The Americans had broken JN-25. They had known about the attack. They had been waiting in ambush. The plan had been too complex, and its execution had been compromised by rigid doctrine and poor tactical decisions. And the battle had been the turning point that destroyed Japan's strategic position in the Pacific. American officers who interrogated Japanese commanders after the war were struck by a consistent theme in their testimony. Many of them admitted that Yamamoto had been the only senior leader who truly understood American industrial capacity and the impossibility of winning a long war against such an opponent. One Japanese officer, in his post-war debriefing, said something that captured the tragedy perfectly. Admiral Yamamoto told us before the war that he could run wild for 6 months, but after that he had no confidence. Midway happened almost exactly 6 months after Pearl Harbor. He was right, but by the time we realized he was right, it was far too late. The production numbers bore out Yamamoto's warnings with mathematical precision. By the end of the war, the United States had produced over 300,000 military aircraft. Japan had produced about 76,000. American ship production exceeded all other nations combined. The industrial avalanche Yamamoto had warned about had buried Japan exactly as he had predicted it would. But Midway was the critical moment. Not because Japan could not have continued fighting after losing 4 carriers, they obviously did continue fighting for 3 more years, but because Midway proved that every fundamental assumption underpinning Japanese strategy was false. American morale was not broken. American intelligence was not blind. American commanders were not timid. American industrial capacity was even greater than Yamamoto, who had seen it firsthand, had feared. And yet, despite Yamamoto's warnings, despite his concerns, despite his questions, none of it had been heeded until it was too late. The plan had gone forward based on wishful thinking and false assumptions. The Wargames had revealed the vulnerability, and that revelation had been dismissed. The concerns of the one man who actually understood the enemy had been waved away as excessive caution. The parallels to other stories of ignored expertise during the war are striking. The German engineer who examined a captured American fighter and realized that Germany could not match such technology but whose warnings were dismissed. The Wehrmacht general who warned that the Ardennes offensive would fail for lack of fuel but whose concerns were overruled. The Luftwaffe commander who recognized that American fighters were superior but whose assessments were rejected. In every case, the pattern was the same. Competent professionals provided accurate assessments based on evidence and experience. Those assessments were dismissed because they contradicted ideology or doctrine. The predictions came true exactly as warned. Thousands died unnecessarily, and the people who had been right received no satisfaction from their vindication because they were either dead or watching their nations collapse. Yamamoto's final vindication was perhaps the bitterest of all. He had been right about everything. The 6-month window, American industrial might, the flaws in the Midway plan, the inevitable long war of attrition, the catastrophic consequences of underestimating the enemy. But being right had not saved his men at Midway. It had not prevented the war. It had not led to peace negotiations before Japan's total defeat. It had simply meant that he had the agonizing experience of watching every prediction come true while being powerless to prevent any of it. The deeper lesson extends far beyond World War II or naval strategy. When institutional cultures punish truth-telling and reward conformity, when ideology becomes more important than evidence, when loyalty is defined as never questioning approved plans, when dissent is career-ending or life-threatening, catastrophic failure becomes not just possible, but inevitable. Organizations that cannot tolerate bad news, that dismiss concerns as pessimism, that rig their planning processes to produce desired outcomes rather than realistic assessments, are setting themselves up for disasters. Midway was not lost in those 5 minutes of dive bomber attacks on the morning of June 4th. It was lost in the months of planning that preceded it, when legitimate concerns were dismissed, when war games were manipulated to hide vulnerabilities, when intelligence warnings were ignored, when the one officer who truly understood the enemy was marginalized and overruled. The battle was the symptom. The disease was a culture that valued conformity over truth, that confused criticism with disloyalty, that made questioning authority more dangerous than making catastrophic mistakes. Yamamoto saw all of this with painful clarity. He understood the flaws in the plan. He recognized the false assumptions. He predicted the outcome. But he could not stop it because the system he operated within did not permit such opposition. And so he followed his orders, led his fleet into battle, and watched helplessly as his every fear came true. In the end, reality does not negotiate. Mathematics does not care about fighting spirit or national character. Industrial capacity trumps tactical brilliance. Resource advantage overcomes courage and sacrifice. These are hard truths, unpleasant truths, truths that challenge comforting narratives about willpower and determination. But they remain true regardless of whether anyone wants to hear them. Admiral Yamamoto understood these truths. He had seen American factories, studied American resources, understood American capabilities. He tried to communicate what he knew to his superiors and colleagues. And he was silenced, not by force, but by a culture that made such warnings unwelcome and such dissent dangerous. His wisdom was ultimately vindicated by events, but by the time that vindication came, it was far, far too late. The ships were sunk, the pilots were dead, the war was lost. And the admiral who had known it all along had himself been killed by the very intelligence failures he had warned about. That is perhaps the greatest tragedy of Midway from the Japanese perspective. Not the tactical defeat, not the loss of ships or the death of pilots, but the fact that it was all preventable. If anyone had been willing to listen to the one man who actually understood what they were facing, if the culture had valued truth over conformity, realistic assessment over wishful thinking, professional expertise over ideological commitment. But those ifs are the saddest words in any historical analysis. What might have been if only someone had listened, if only the warnings had been heeded, if only the truth had been told and accepted. Yamamoto knew the truth. He spoke the truth, and the truth was ignored until reality forced everyone to acknowledge it through the most brutal teacher of all. Defeat.